The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Ann Cosgrove, the editor-in-chief of Facility Executive Magazine, and today's webinar on HVAC resiliency for COVID-19 and beyond is presented by Carbon Lighthouse, and we do have several speakers and panelists you'll see today who you will hear from. Before we get started, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. See the control panel on your screen. This is where you can submit questions to us. We will do a Q&A at the end of the panel discussion, so please take your questions in during the discussion or at the end as they come up, and we will address them. The other thing is, if you have any technical difficulties or additional behind-the-scenes questions, you can send us questions there, and someone will address you privately in that question section. If you're interested in continuing education credits, you will receive an email from Facility Executive after this webinar, and you can submit that to your association for the CEUs. Just want to bring it back to the topic, and this webinar focuses on bringing together several leaders, as you see on our panel today. They're at the intersection of energy and energy management, and today we want to discuss strategies for HVAC resiliency as we all work to create safe buildings for our occupants to come back to, and obviously beyond the immediate impacts as well of COVID-19 that we're dealing with. So I will, without further ado, I'll let us introduce our panelists. I'll let them introduce themselves, and we will start with Greg Fischer. Greg, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Ann. So good morning, everybody on the West Coast, and good afternoon to everybody on the East Coast. I'm Greg Fischer. I'm CEO of Fischer Energy Partners based out of New York. A lot of people know me from my previous career at Tishman Speyer as the Director of Energy. But before that, I was on the sell side of the business as a Schneider Electric building automation and trained turnkey and energy services contractor, doing everywhere from project management to project development for large existing buildings. The vision of Fischer Energy Partners was to harness that technical and professional experience on both sides of the business into an immersive consultative company, where everything from energy storage systems and controls to leasing language and asset valuations is all looked at through a single lens. A full holistic approach to energy management is key to speaking many different languages throughout the development, procurement, and execution process. But a true cradle-to-grave approach to the business includes being involved from the immediate step one concept, all the way through the commissioning, adoption, and service phases of complex projects. What gets me up every day is the possibility of formulating and then executing that big existing building retro project that has an intense impact on the way buildings not only consume energy, but also procure it, bill for it, store it, analyze it, visualize it. I'm sure we're all into, I'm sure we'll get into it much later on with the Climate Mobilization Act of New York City. But there are a whole lot of buildings out there that will be incurring some pretty hefty penalties. I want to say to the tune of 70 to 80% of existing facilities within the New York region. The time to act is now. Master planning is and taking bite-sized chunks of that ultimate goal of avoidance is key. So Fischer Energy is designed for planning those that avoidance, maximizing incentive through subsidies. And projects through latest and greatest impact technologies to increase asset value, raise those building letter grades, and decrease the impact of local law 97. And in essence, build some pretty cool stuff. Before I hand it over to Matt for his introduction, I want to say that times of uncertainty like this one give way to amazing things. I think the difficult part of the time we're currently in will pass, but one of the more interesting things I've noticed about this historical moment is the technology boom that is only beginning. If it's to avoid physical contact, if it's to police social distancing better, if it's remote controlling and optimizing our facilities, or simply to know that loved ones are doing okay, we are in a time of extreme innovation, and it really lends itself to human ingenuity. So with that, I'll hand it over to Matt.
Cool, thanks for the intro and enjoy the perspective. So I'm Matt. I have the privilege of leading the technology and engineering functions here at Carbon Lighthouse, where we are trying to stop climate change. It's a big world, there's many existential challenges. This is the one we have decided to work on. What I think is really interesting about this moment is the obvious. Will this lead to greater modernization of buildings or not? Nearly a half century ago, OPEC successfully implemented an oil embargo that shook the world's energy economy. It led to an upheaval in global politics, but also the birth of the modern era of energy. It heralded the arrival of wind and solar and other technologies that we have today. And it was all triggered by sudden and unexpected event. Today, commercial real estate faces dual headwinds of a tough economy layered with a literal pandemic. And in the largest and only work from home experiment in history, businesses are now openly questioning the value of rent, and landlords are facing abatement or deferment questions every day. And I think it begs the question of what is the value of office space or building generally? Why do we need them, and how do we make them safe and productive spaces? One sign of progress, ventilation stories have been on the front page of major news outlets, probably for the first time since Willis Carrier and his invention of modern HVAC at the beginning of the 20th century. And I am hopeful it is a sign of the things to come in our space. With that, I'll hand it off to Dan.
Hi, my name is Dan Mestis, and I'm the engineering manager for Bank of Hawaii. We're a regional bank covering the state of Hawaii and also West Pacific, Guam, Saipan, and Palau in particular. My role with the bank is that I'm responsible for the reliable operations and maintenance of all critical infrastructure and building systems of our owned and leased properties. These are mostly bank branches and some of our corporate buildings and things like that. And within a lot of those buildings, we do have corporate tenants that we take care of, and we're responsible for their spaces as well. Prior to working at the bank, I worked for PepsiCo in manufacturing, plant operations, excuse me, various roles in production, maintenance, plant engineering. And that's where I really learned more about energy fundamentals and energy management in an industrial setting. And using the total productive manufacturing principles, we really learned how to optimize processes and systems in all departments and walks of life inside of a factory. And I was able to take that experience over to the bank and really start looking at ways to automate, to improve, to gather more data for us to make decisions off of, and especially in this type of a situation where some of your buildings might not be as modernized as others, and you're depending on a lot more qualitative observations and things like that. And it's really shown the need for more data and able to really see what's going on in the buildings as well as control what's going on after you make process changes. With this challenge that we have in front of us, I found it very interesting. We're in a state of emergency, so the more we can learn about this virus, the better, but we have to take action quickly. And this is difficult to balance. We really need to understand every step of the way how the situation is progressing, both internally with our company and externally, and the perceptions that our employees and customers have. It's been very difficult. So the piece that has been important for us specifically is that whenever we make changes to our process or an environment, since it is kind of an emergency and somewhat of an unplanned type situation, we have to be careful that we don't trigger any new or unintended consequences. And so taking others with you is critical, and keeping everyone informed and up to speed on how things are changing, what we're doing in the company, and more specifically what we're doing with our ventilation and everything is extremely important. And I'll leave you with that and hand it over to Anne.
Thank you. Thanks, gentlemen. So, okay, well, we're going to dive right in. We will first have a poll question. So you will see that on your screen. We just want to get a sense of who's in the audience today. There'll be two questions. This is the first one, asking what your role is, which best describes you. Property manager, facility manager, building engineer, building manager, or owner. If you can let us know that. We'll then show the results on the screen, and then we'll have a second question as well. And then we'll jump in. Okay, so it looks like we have the Majority facility managers, 63%, followed by building engineer 21, and followed by the rest with some single digits. So thank you very much, everyone. And we'll just put that second question up, which will pop up on the screen momentarily. And so we're asking if you would like to, oh, I don't know if we're going to get that poll. So if not, we'll just kind of move forward unless it pops up. But okay, here it is. Sorry about that. Do commercial buildings need to be modernized with new technology? So based on what our panelists have just commented on, we want to hear your own take on that. Very simple, yes or no. See where you're at or what you're thinking at this time. Do these buildings need to be modernized? Are we in a yes? Let's see, 97%, 98% yes. We'll show that on the screen in a moment, but it looks like pretty much almost everyone in the audience agrees that we do need to modernize. So that's a lot of what we'll be talking about today with HVAC in mind. So thank you. Okay, so just to kind of reiterate what Greg, Matt, and Dan had talked about here, you know, COVID has certainly presented new and unique challenges. It's probably not news to any of you out there. It's also highlighted vulnerabilities in buildings and commercial real estate, inhibiting the kind of resiliency needed now as we prepare for reopening or as you're reopening. And we want to talk about how the panelists here have been navigating through the past few months with their buildings, their clients, and how technology and data can play a role in building resiliency as we move forward. So with that, I'm going to ask you a question, Dan. Of course, this is an open conversation, and audience, please do send in your questions, as we do want to hear from you as well. So Dan, I want to talk to you about you and your facilities and your experience. And again, Greg and Matt, jump in afterwards if you'd like. As shelter-in-place orders, you know, swept the country and hit your facilities and your locations, can you tell us just what some of the first steps were that you took to safely shut down your buildings, or maybe prepare them for an extended period of low occupancy? What was those early days like, and what did you move forward with?
Sure. A lot of the discussions early on were at the higher levels with respect to which locations needed to stay open and which ones we could shut down while still being able to support our customers. So once I had that information, we really started first looking at our staffing and ensuring that we had folks available, not just at our headquarters where we did have some in-house staff, but also available to start deploying out and working more on site with some of these locations for some of the tactics I'm going to mention. The first thing we did was take a look at our service contracts, and we needed to make adjustments across the board to better deal with the situation. Some we could simply cancel, some we needed to maintain. We decided to obviously continue with our air conditioning maintenance even for the shutdown buildings. And then some things we increased. For instance, for the locations that we completely closed temporarily for this time, we increased our site visits from our property managers and contractors because we knew we didn't have people in these locations, and we needed to ensure we didn't have any emergencies or anything pop up in those assets that would then take our focus away from the ones that would remain open. Other contracts we modified accordingly, either increasing the frequency or decreasing in some cases for things like, like plant rentals, for instance. Some of those things were unnecessary, so we could pause those sort of contracts so we could focus more on the things that were health, safety, and environmental related. The other thing we needed to do right away was reduce our light and air conditioning usage, what we could in the closed locations. So we don't have building automation systems everywhere yet. So this took a lot of site visits and adjusting timers and things like that we utilized. My maintenance supervisor as well as some of our contractors for that. For the closed locations as well, we closed our outside air intakes and increased the thermostats up to about 75 degrees. This wasn't the first thing that we did initially. At first, we kind of left it as is, and we noticed we had a couple humidity issues pop up with the help of Carbon Lighthouse's sensor deployment that we asked to do in a couple of these locations in order to better understand it, because we did not have humidistats or anything like that in there. We only had zone temperature. recording. So once we had attained this data, we realized that we should have just closed the outside air. And once we did that, the humidity issues went away in these closed branches. The other thing that we did was for our water systems in these locations that were closed, we didn't want to start having any kind of bacteria issues or new things pop up when we went to go reopen. So on those weekly site visits that I mentioned, we also were running the water system. So running faucets, flushing toilets, things like that to ensure that we did not have any stagnation and further jeopardize any kind of health and safety in the locations. And then the next thing for the closed locations was we reprioritized a lot of our repairs. So we looked back into our work orders and some of our project lists, and we pulled out some of the ones that we needed to move forward and execute in those closed locations to catch up on some of the work, which enabled us to do it on straight time, and it also enabled us to, take care of it without any interruptions to the operations. With respect to reopening and some of the locations that are open, we reformatted our layouts inside of respect to furniture and desks and queuing lines, et cetera, to really enhance the social distancing and get beyond 6 feet, so that we never had anyone that was kind of nervous, employees and customers included. Additionally, we deployed sneeze guards to every customer-facing site in our portfolio, and of course, we are presently upgrading to MERV 13 minimum, increasing our outside air, and investigating ultraviolet and net bipolar ionization. We also implemented wayfinding because we wanted to make sure that we're not getting in too close of a quarters in our offices and things like that. So we redid all the pathways, segmented the restrooms, put signage in the elevators, just to make sure that the social distancing is understood and exactly how many people should be in any type of place or corridor. And one of the coolest things that we did was we repurposed a lot of our operations staff in the closed locations to assist in this new operating environment, especially with a lot of the PPP loan system and the SBA loans, as well as taking care of some of the extra customers and helping them in this new situation. Those employees were repurposed there to the call center. They were all trained on the fly to start taking on other roles to help move this forward as quickly as we could. And as well, the final thing was we even created some backup sites for certain operations in the case that we had some issues and needed to relocate due to either the operation wasn't working quite well in the new normal or other aspects. So that's pretty much what we've done, and it's been very, very effective with the employees, and everyone's really on board and understanding what's going on, and the communication really helped with that.
Thank you. Greg or Matt, would you like to comment on what you saw in the early days, what you did with your clients, or as well?
Yeah, I actually had a question for Dan. It sounds like you're on a couple of different sides. One being you have your own employees that you're making sure that they're feeling okay coming back to work and coming into your spaces. But also, it sounds like that you're a tenant in larger buildings. Were there any sort of demands or requests from your part as a tenant in a facility, so that the base building was doing something to make your corporation feel safer within the facility?
Yes, typically when we go and lease sites, we end up doing the air conditioning upgrades, and we control those assets. But we did have a few, about 3, that we don't control the air conditioning, and it was provided by the landlords. And so for those, we reached out to the landlords with the CDC and ASHRAE guidelines, and have been working with them to understand their equipment and what we can do to help to get them across the finish line, because we're finding, some of the landlords aren't as astute to these technologies and changes that are being made in the building. So we've had to work with them hand in hand to go through these changes and get them implemented.
Great, thank you.
Any other
I was
comments?
curious, Dan, I think a quick one. I think the seizing the moment to follow up on deferred maintenance is an interesting one. Is there a particular flavor or type of work that you've been able to do more of that is usually harder with normal occupancy regimes?
Just some of the items that require downtime in the kind of customer areas, like maybe touching up paint or replacing carpet or doing an LED lighting retrofit we did, and we were able to do, even some energy projects, catching up on some of that stuff where we just had more activity in the location, and so it was a lot easier to coordinate. It wasn't anything really in particular that we pulled forward. It was just that we had a lot more opportunity to get these done because the sites were closed, but also since there weren't as many work orders being put in because the wear and tear was reduced since our portfolio was temporarily cut in half, that enabled us to focus on catch up and doing more things to push the business forward in our department.
Now, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but in your neck of the woods, there is very, very high energy costs where you are. Were there any sort of mitigation strategies to offset the increase in outside air coming into the facilities and the UV the deployments and things of that nature? Were you looking at it from a how do I offset that so I can remain neutral with these new ASHRAE guidelines?
Yeah, I definitely was. As soon as I saw the guidelines, that was at the forefront of my mind, but I have to be sensitive to the perception with kind of pushing some of the energy savings while still maintaining safety in this COVID-19 world now. So one of the things that I noticed right away was that if you're going to have a reduced occupancy in your building in the new normal, then you're effectively impacting your outside air and your CO2 levels right there. So like they said, we want to increase the outside air. So some folks might have a tendency to just go right to the damper and open it up more. But you really have to look at your occupancy and where you're going to be after this change, because in some cases, you may not have to do anything. You can leave that damper where it is because that will provide the excess. So that piece was very important to understand up front. The challenge is getting others to understand and jump on board with that thought and not just increasing the outside air from where you were because your baseline might not have been correct. In another case, for instance, our headquarters, we found that we had a large excess of outside air well above code in a section of the building. So we really need to reset to where we're supposed to be and then increase from that point. And that concept has been difficult for folks to grasp as well, that an increase needs to be from your code base or wherever your base is, not just from where you were. So the kind of retro commissioning and digging in to your system and understanding it right away through either some quick measurements or a full testing, adjusting, and balancing study is definitely beneficial and can help.
Thank you. Thanks, gentlemen. So I just want to move on to the next question, and we've got some good conversation going. So you talked a little bit about this already, but I wanted to know, during the quiet period, some may still be going through that quiet period, we're coming out of it depending where you're located, but what are some of the strategies that you or your clients have deployed to keep your buildings in sound technical condition throughout that period, and how did technology help play a role? Greg, I'd like to point that to you first.
Yeah, and so as far as the technological upgrades and maintaining safety and standards within the facility, there's really one word that I like to focus in on, and it's sensors. Sensors have an explosion of popularity, and they're everywhere from the standard comfort sensors that everybody knows for temperature and humidity, to indoor air quality for particulate matter, for ozone, carbon dioxide. occupancy sensors to understand, much like what Dan was describing about wayfinding and location patterns of people, to thermal scanners for COVID symptom sensing. There's even things called virtual sensors. These are sensors that don't even physically exist, but use but extrapolate information from nearby sensors to give a good estimation of what an area of value would be. Pretty much anything from temperature to humidity to occupancy. But existing devices even that you wouldn't even think are sensors in their traditional format are becoming smart. Take, for example, a security camera in a lobby. With the use of software and that dumb camera, the building is now identifying you, understanding if you're wearing a mask or not, counting you, taking your temperature, tracking where you're going, and even identifying if you're performing an act of law breaking or code breaking. Sensors are really everywhere, and they're growing by the second. And this explosion of sensors can be both good and bad in a way. Good in the sense that people think of a sensor in a traditional format where a piece of information, you're always knowing the piece of information is more than not knowing that piece of information. But when you have a thing to keep in mind while looking at sensors is that deploying sensor networks and many different kinds of sensors it's important to understand how to interpret and analyze large amounts of data. This is when sensors can become bad or maybe useless in some cases. A single sensor can produce anywhere from, just the single value of what you would think of, or up to 20, 30 points of information, which just multiplies as you deploy more and more of them. So how do you use all those data streams and put them to work? How do you create action? How do you create a plan with all of these different sensors? There are important conversations that need to be had, but data can be extremely overwhelming. Everybody can relate to a spreadsheet and understanding, looking at values in cells. But if you can imagine 100,000 column spreadsheet that's updating every 1, 5, 15 minutes with all of those 100,000 values, it could get overwhelming. No human on earth can really crank through that raw data of that magnitude and create action in any sort of live or even semi-live format. So it's absolutely impossible, and computer systems are key to and with the pairing of the internet and the ever-expanding bandwidth increases of the internet, that data highway is of key importance to digest that information remotely and then spit back some recommendations and suggestions, and maybe sometimes even take care of minor tasks within the facility. This is why the Public Service Commission and organizations like NYSERDA pumped $40 million into the Real-Time Energy Management Program, or RTEM, which happens to be one of their most successful programs of all time for several reasons. But they understood the importance of extracting that data, getting it out of the buildings, and having it digested in analytics and AI engines. Sadly, that program is being sunsetted, and its target is mid-2021. But I think that's going to give birth to many other programs like it, which target certain vertical markets that the state has trouble penetrating in a lot of ways. One of them being commercial tenants. Commercial tenants, as a lot of people know, consume a lot of the base building's energy usage. That I feel like is going to be a target market for somebody like New York State. I think one of the important takeaways from this time and the flood of technology and these sensor networks we are experiencing is to have a plan to create action with data. The more data you have, the more action there will be. But more of an informed building personnel and tenant occupancy will be you'll be able to course correct when things like energy or air quality or even social distancing become poor or compromised. Humans are sensor networks themselves, as everybody knows. Sound, feel, taste, smell. But the most important part of handling all of those data streams that I'm talking about is being able to visualize data. So vision. like I said before, raw data is in Excel cells it's useless to a human. But bringing data to life and visualizing it through charts, graphs, graphics, reports is great. The next technology stack above those sensors, though, and extracting all of those disparate system data streams is what I like to call a master systems integration. Other people know it as digital twins, where you are virtually representing a physical asset in the virtual space and overlaying that data, so that you can start visualizing large amounts of it and produce action. When you have all of these data streams, I like to call it analysis paralysis. So you have all these different data streams, it becomes daunting. Too much data, too many systems, too many dashboards, too many graphics. So what gets done when that happens? Potentially nothing, because it's like a person who cried wolf. The digital twin environment is designed so that you are accessing one system for your facility, like let's say a Windows operating system, with access to all of those disparate systems, and them being organized in a thoughtful way to evoke action rather than paralysis.
Hey, Greg, I was curious when, thinking about all these different sensors and the layering of technology. So I can see for some of the marquee CRE players that is, makes a lot of sense. But I'm also thinking that, like, the non-Dans of the world, but the people who maybe have limited staffs, limited resources, more of a regional player where they maybe only own or operate 2 or 3 buildings. What are some of the key sensors or the key data points do you think really are the things that they should be aware of right now?
Yeah. So as far as when it comes to COVID-19, there is a heavy emphasis now on indoor air quality. It was a trend as everybody knows before, but now it's become a heavy focus, just because of the peripherals of what a virus means within a space and how to I guess corral that virus or corral that spread of the virus. Things that are peripherally related to actually detecting the virus, maybe that might be particulate matter and understanding what level of microns you're filtering through your HVAC systems, or if it's the UV lighting that kills the virus itself. Whole slew of different things. I feel like indoor air quality is really going to take off here. And I think everybody wants to be in a healthy space by default. They want to know that they're in a good hygiene space to begin with. No matter if it's COVID-19 or if it's your home, you want to make sure that you're breathing good air and that you're in healthy spaces. So I think that translates from the home all the way to the office space. But those streams of information it can come fast and furious and at high volumes. So being able to interpret and create action, I think, is very important.
Thank you, gentlemen. I actually want to jump in with an attendee question that's come in. Kind of just talked about not indoor air quality specifically, but something that are balancing certain aspects. And the question is, this is out to any of you, balancing sustainability, efficiency, and safety. For balancing those things, the sustainability, efficiency, energy efficiency, or otherwise, and safety. What is a better operating procedure, as you've seen so far? Is it 24/7 operation of the systems, or pre and post occupancy purges? So, that constant running the system, or are you leaning more toward pre and post purges? Have you seen anything on that in your experience to date?
I'll jump in real quick. I think a good mix of making sure that there is airflow and that there is good exhaust and filtration procedures is important. But I also think mixed with other different technologies, like, let's say, UVC sort of lighting during unoccupied times, to disinfect surfaces, and maybe personal air purifiers. I think a mix of both the HVAC and some other devices and strategies might be a good trend, because as you get into the as you get into the design of facilities and pushing that envelope of how they were designed, you're going to come up to some limitations that are going to cost a lot to modify in very large volumes and to very large scales. So I think that mix of technology is going to be really key. I would love to hear from Matt and Dan too.
Yeah, we're seeing the same thing with the mix. Some locations have more advanced infrastructure than others, and in those, we may not be able to put in a HEPA filter or increase the outside air as much. So we're looking at portable HEPA scrubbers for some of these small locations. We even have some branches that are in remote areas on Maui that have just a window unit inside of it. So we have to really change our strategy for those locations and put in HEPA scrubbers and possibly some UVC for those. So yeah, a mix is definitely how it's going to end up.
Yeah, same on us. It's the same story. We're really recommending kind of a smarter road down the middle, where you can pair COVID measures, not all of them to the extreme, but do some of them. And if you do it right, you can actually pair with other efficiency measures as well. Just to kind of give us a perspective of that, this is for one of our buildings in Los Angeles. It's about 115,000 square feet, central plant with air handlers, baseline energy spend around 230,000 a year. If you just take the ASHRAE COVID measures and implement them bluntly or to the extreme, your energy bill will balloon to nearly $400,000 over a 75% increase. But if that building implements a smarter way, we believe that that building can achieve the same level of safety and comfort for more around 260,000 or lower than the baseline consumption. Buildings had plenty of excess energy consumption before. The current moment is exacerbating that. And often it's not just because of older equipment and controls, but it's also because of inadequate controls, lack of data, and lack of technology, applying that data, as Greg was talking about, to manage that energy spend. And so COVID's actually interesting because you might be able to solve, or we believe you can solve both of those with the right mix of investments. Not only in how you would attack COVID, you can also attack your baseline energy spend. You can make your buildings not only safer, but potentially save money or at least offset those costs from COVID mitigation measures right now.
Thank you. Thanks for talking about that. I think we're going to have a poll right now. Since we've been talking about technology, we're going to put up a poll, and then I want to pose a few more questions to you gentlemen. And the poll is to the audience. So which of the following technological challenges have you experienced in managing your properties since COVID shelter in place? And there's several choices here. Communication with staff, communication with occupants, HVAC control, or other building systems control. You can choose all that apply or none of the above. Okay, and then we'll show the results. Moment. Let's see. Almost half HVAC control, followed by communication with occupants, other building systems controls, and communication with staff, or none of the above. Okay, thank you all. So Matt, I did want to jump back to a question that we had. We were talking about, the quiet period after COVID, and now that we're getting back into, depending on everyone's, obviously their different path, but now that some people are getting back on track and getting people back in the buildings. What are some of the energy trends that you're seeing with your clients at Carbon Lighthouse? And you just talked a little bit about given the impact on energy use. What were some of the initial reactions from operators? Were your clients, do nothing, making adjustments? And I've talked a little bit about this. You're bringing a third-party vendor. What kind of guidance were they looking for? What did you see out in the field?
So most clients have seen reductions that corresponded with shelter in place, but what I think has been surprising is that the reductions are not nearly as large as one might think. And so just pulling from our own data, for office as a vertical, nearly 2/3 of our sites have showed a decrease in electricity consumption since shelter in place, averaging a little under about a 23% reduction or so. About a quarter of our sites have shown no decrease in electricity consumption at all. And the remaining fraction have shown an initial decrease in electricity consumption, but it's been followed by an updrift in consumption at or sometimes above pre-COVID year-on level comparisons. And for the updrift or the sites that are exceeding their original energy consumption, COVID mitigation has been identified as the cause for most of these. For hotels, it's been a larger drop. Almost all hotels that we work with have dropped with an average decrease of about 37%, which is almost double the average reduction for offices. And I think what's interesting for people is kind of on hotels versus offices. The hotel drops tend to be larger because they're not bound by lease requirements. Larger hotels do have a base load, but the incremental load tends to scale more with guest headcount, whereas offices still have HVAC requirements if the office is empty. Sticking with offices, I think one thing that catches people off guard or surprise even is that the energy reductions are not larger. For office, occupancy rates right now are nationally hovering 10 to 20% versus February. But why is the energy consumption not 10 or 20% versus a year-on-year comparison? And a large part of that is because energy loads do not scale with headcount as much as people might think. According to our data, people contribute between 5 and 31% of a building's load, and the rest comes from lighting, printers, coffee machines, but most importantly, outdoor air temperature, sunlight. Those are the variables that largely dictate energy consumption and therefore energy spend. And I think what's interesting is there hasn't been as much action on reducing energy, in part because a lot of operators were anticipating a re-entry to office and hotel in maybe May or June. But I think the realization is starting to really sink in that this is going to be, at minimum, protracted.
Hey, Matt, I had a quick question, and sorry to interrupt. So when we're not seeing a proportional reaction of occupancy versus energy usage, do you think potentially that the vast majority of these commercial tenants and their lease structures lend itself to the base building pretty much running all out, even if they were unoccupied, just because of the legal language that's in their lease? Like, I know from my previous days at Tishman Speyer that a lot of the gross modified leases, they are very short on HVAC verbiage, which pretty much says I need 1.5 inches of static pressure, I need 44-degree air, 44-degree chill water, 80-degree condenser water, and that was pretty much it. Like, that is the legal language that's there. If you don't provide that as a base building, are you violating that lease? I would argue potentially yes, and maybe that's why these building systems are not scaling to the occupancy level as much.
No, that's right, Greg. And certainly, I think the interpretation of that varies a little bit from client to client, but an interesting service that we are increasingly providing is giving our clients insight into the occupancy of their spaces. We are one of those companies that uses hundreds of sensors in a building to really understand how the space is utilized and how they're, where people are, how they're using the space, how many, what are the relative loads. That data historically has been about helping create more dynamic control strategies, but increasingly, some of our clients are seeing the value in that and really understanding, are these spaces occupied or aren't they? And why do I need to provide HVAC service if no one has been there for weeks and no one will be there for weeks? It has been really interesting starting to engage with clients less around these dynamic control changes for just small headcount changes versus much larger shifts in occupancy and the resulting impact on things like HVAC service to spaces.
I think you probably see a lot of these leases get amended with occupancy, right?
I would be surprised if it doesn't become a larger conversation. Historically, it's, I think most HVAC systems struggle to be these dynamic, adaptive systems that I think a lot of us are trained or believe. I think the average person thinks a building is as complex and censored up as an iPhone, but the truth is far from that. And this current pandemic is really exposing those limitations right now. And a building is certainly both legally, but technologically, normally not really capable of adjusting to such radical load shifts.
Yeah. Gentlemen, there's been some talk about, and we have some questions coming in too about obviously health, safety, and how the HVAC system can play into that. So I do want to ask you, Dan, for your own facilities, or Greg or Matt, in your work as well with clients, in terms of CDC and ASHRAE guidance, what role is that doing in your work? Are you following that for preventing or limiting the spread of COVID through the HVAC system? And in those cases, are you or your clients performing their own due diligence and deploying strategies accordingly, or kind of what has been your experience with following these guidelines? Everyone's aware of this guidance now, and I just want to hear your take on that as far as the best way to kind of put that into practice so far, what you've seen.
Well, the thing with ours is, like we touched on, a lot of the assets and the locations are different. So there's not really an approach that you can just apply on everything, at least in our portfolio. So we are using some internal resources, like for instance, at our headquarters, I'm extremely involved with that location, and we're almost done implementing a project there that essentially makes every piece of equipment in that chiller plant and air handling and VAV system variable. And so that one, we had a lot more ability to affect and kind of just implement a lot of the guidelines right away. And we had more instrumentation at that site to help us figure some of this out. So, but then on the flip side, we're still using some of our design engineering firms to help get through some of the calculations and review the drawings and figure out our baseline. But yes, we're applying the guidelines fully for all of our locations. It's just a mixture, like we said, of solutions.
Okay, thank you. I have a few more follow-ups in that regard, if no other comments. So about CDC guidance, one of our attendees had written in that encourages more outside air, he notes, but you can only do so much. So has anyone figured out how to use, it says BIM readings here, or I would say building automation system readings as well, such as humidity, CO2, other factors to maximize outside air while maintaining comfort. So I see that as a way. How do you, go encourage more outside air? But is there a way to use the data that you can get if you have that system in place?
Greg, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So, what I was speaking about before about these systems and the way the spaces were designed. Yeah, there are going to be some limitations that people are going to experience with, let's say a building that was designed only to have minimum outside air come into their fan plenum area to be distributed throughout the space. Now, naturally, they're not going to be able to increase the size of that duct or that opening going into the fan room to actually bring in more outside air. So how do you accomplish that? Those are a lot of the questions that probably Dan's consulting engineers are looking into. But as far as keeping space comfortable, a lot of these systems, if they're existing buildings, and they were built, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, a lot of them are oversized systems to begin with, and they're already tailored to handle the worst case scenarios. Traditionally, I've seen very large built up air handling units and very large central plants that are very much oversized. And pre-COVID, we were looking at all different ways to try and take advantage of those oversized systems to try and reduce that energy as much as possible. Now with the ASHRAE standard and conservatism reigning supreme here with the air quality aspect of what we're talking about, we are now resetting that baseline all the way up from where it was before to something much larger. So I would say every building's going to be different. As Matt and Dan and Ann know, every building is very, very different, and are going to have its own complexities when answering that question. But it's going to be tough.
And we did find what you said, Greg, with some of our older locations. They already had plenty of excess outside air, so it's easier to deal with. fortunately, some of our newer ones, the duct is a little bit oversized and we have a damper there, so we're able to achieve that. We haven't found one so far that we have to supplement a DOAS or something like that, but not to say that that's not going to happen though.
Yeah, I'll add the for being able to determine if you have sufficient outside air. It's not a very complicated calculation if you have the right data for it. So there's a few ways to go about it. You can kind of virtually create an outdoor air percentage point, like Greg talked about earlier. You can measure it more directly with some equipment as well, but there's certainly ways to empirically understand, are you providing sufficient HVAC? To get more ventilation outdoor air, it can be tricky in some buildings. This is getting into the weeds a little bit, but especially for some older systems, you kind of have to get kind of clever with your duct static pressure, with your SAT set point, in order to force more ventilation in. But like Greg said, I think most people are under the assumption that surely my building needs a lot more air, but in general, systems are already designed to meet a lot of the guidelines that are out there. And some of the conservatism that's out there, while it's certainly warranted from a risk understanding perspective, our view is that some of those things make sense, but some of them can be very expensive to do, both upfront and in terms of operating expense. So like outdoor air or moving to HEPA filters or 24/7 operation, these are reasonable to consider, but certainly we think the same level of safety can be had, but without the added expense. But in an era where tenants are now Googling ASHRAE CDC headlines and demanding that their buildings meet those guidelines, it certainly puts operators in a tough spot about how do you balance that, what is maybe scientifically accurate versus what is more emotionally or feels safe enough. It's an interesting place for buildings to be in right now.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So we have just a little bit of time left, and we certainly want to get through one more question I had for you, and then we have some audience questions as well. So this is kind of circling back, and you know, Dan, maybe you can tackle this first. You know, the role of HVAC is now front and center with regard to COVID, as we all know. That's you know, why our folks are here today, and what many of us have been thinking about for many months now. So how do you see the HVAC new role impacting resiliency in corporate real estate, commercial real estate, buildings beyond COVID? You know, how do you see that new role shaping up?
Well, it's definitely brought a lot of new awareness, and folks are starting to understand more about the components in an air conditioning system, which I think is great. It helps building operators and engineering folks be understood and probably achieve some more buy-in along the way. It's also going to help with higher standards for indoor air quality, and I think folks will probably start to notice the differences in maybe health and productivity with some of the additional outside air, and there's plenty of studies that back that up as well. With the landlord and tenant relationship, I think we'll get better because, again, that education and understanding piece, and I'm hoping that it will get some folks out of the lowest first cost mentality, and also explore more adaptability and modularity with HVAC systems, because folks are realizing, oh, you mean I can't just drop in a HEPA filter? It's this big, it's not 2 inches. You know, I gotta weld racks and do all these calculations on my system to see if it can handle this. I thought it was just dropping in a filter, you know. So I think for me, I'm hoping that more adaptability and modularity happens with systems, and you can make changes and convert things maybe more easily in the future. And with respect to energy and the COVID-19 impacts, I hope to see a lot more retro commissioning happening and folks finding the value in that, because I'm sure they're going to have to do that with COVID. Implementing more variable speed drives, VRF systems, DOAS, and still demand controlled ventilation can be a good thing if you're counting your occupants and you just change your CO2 set points to be, you know, at a lower value, et cetera. But I think it's going to help with the infrastructure that will get put in place and the knowledge base and the buy-in to get these projects approved in the future. And with the increase in cost of these changes, it's going to help. It's going to help justify some of those projects because now the savings are higher.
Yeah, Dan, I think you're making some great points, and I always like to look at things with COVID that there are ways to offset that increased cost in energy by bringing in, more outside air, or deploying UV lights, or installing that MERV 13 or 16 or HEPA filter that's going to increase your differential pressure going through your fan plenum. I like to think that there are these offsets that were maybe potentially disabled on a system beforehand. Take, for example, a strategy like a low flow, low temp strategy, where you are burdening the central plant to produce lower chilled water in central plant buildings, obviously, to have your fan speeds go at lower flow rates, and also your pumps go at lower flow rates. That same amount of tonnage, if you were in your old way of operating or your new way of operating, you're actually going to be much more adaptable by lowering your chill water temperatures and your discharge air temperatures, and be able to meet some of the ASHRAE standards of having low flow through your filtration system, and be able to offset potentially the increased energy of bringing in more outside air by loading up the most efficient part of your heat rejection system, which is most likely your chiller in central plant buildings. So I like the idea of the engineering brain going 2-3 steps beyond just the immediate need, which is obviously safety, but going into other strategies that were either disabled or not enabled to begin with.
And I'll add on top of that, no disagreements. I think interesting points. For my view, I think it's having an amplifying effect on the value of resiliency. If you just look at this, take stock of recent history just on the West Coast, we've had wildfires resulting in air quality issues that caused businesses and school closures. We've had rolling blackouts leading to hotel cancellations and lost revenue. These are preventable and solvable with the right mix of equipment, controls, data standardization, technology, but probably more beyond that is acceptance from an industry that needs a longer viewpoint than I think it currently has.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. We will jump in. We have time for a few more questions from the audience. I thank you all for sending your questions in. So if we can also, yeah, there we go, questions. Let's see, we have quite a number, and I do want to let any of you who don't have your questions addressed, you will be able to have your questions addressed offline, in some way. So don't think that's lost in cyberspace. The questions are, one of the questions I want to ask, certainly a concern for a lot, and it's been touched on a little bit here. Are there any suggestions for HVAC systems to help handle COVID in the airstream, in addition to upgrading filters? So any things that you've seen or done, or kind of seen be recommended at this date that you might want to share?
I think Dan and Greg talked about it too, but just to echo it, UVGI, or ultraviolet germicidal irradiation, you can do that in the space itself. It almost looks like a light fixture that you have on the wall. I'd say it's a little unsightly, so if you're going for that mid-century modern look, it'll throw that off a little bit in your space, but it certainly is a realistic strategy. The other one that actually treats the air itself would be the equivalent, but in duct or in the air handler itself. That is more expensive, and traditionally a lot of that technology is designed more for preventing your cooling coils from molding over and that sort of thing. However, we're starting to see some specs that actually look pretty legitimate, that have enough exposure and wattage to actually, well, irradiate and harm the virus.
Okay. All right, so I think we have time for one more question. I appreciate everyone's time. I do want to ask, we've been discussing the role of technology with COVID pandemic, and obviously that's been a conversation for improving facility management commercial real estate operations overall, even in the past before this. So do you see technology, it's an opportunity for greater modernization and preparedness for the future? Kind of what are maybe just a high point you see as what technology can do? There's so many obviously different options. So maybe what's the most important advancement you might want to see, or that you have seen in practice to date?
Yeah, I think we touched on it a little bit during this hour, but getting data out of the four walls of the building and into some pretty cool ways to visualize and analyze that data is an important step towards doing some pretty cool things that might involve some outside of box thinking, and can fuel some good conversations. So I think yeah, the building automation system being packaged and holding data is the thing of the past. Getting it out and having it analyzed is where it needs to be.
Yeah, I'll jump on that real quick. I think data standardization, it's certainly not very glamorous, but data comes from many different protocols. It's stored in innumerable manners and volumes, various levels of accuracy, inconsistent naming conventions. There's lack of metadata and descriptions. It means that in our space, big data is more of a punchline than a value generator.
All right. Okay. Well, I just want to thank you all. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time. We do, before we sign off, we do have to all you out in the audience, we have a fourth poll that we'd like to put out just to kind of wrap things up, see where everyone's at the end of this hour. So will you be making investments in technology to better prepare you for future disruptions when it comes to your HVAC systems and facing the situations at hand? So please just let us know, yes or no. And I do want to thank Greg, Dan, and Matt again for your time. And thank you to Carbon Lighthouse for sponsoring the webinar. Lastly, a recording of the talk will be available online at facilityexecutive.com, as well as on the Carbon Lighthouse website, and that's carbonlighthouse.com. So if you want to review what was discussed here and share it with colleagues, etc., there will also be the contact information for each of our panelists in that presentation in a slide, so you'll be able to see that as well. And as you see, 87% yes, do plan on making investments in technology at this time. So thank you. All right. Well, thank you, Greg. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Matt. Appreciate your time. Thanks very much. And to our audience, of course. And let's stay in touch and continue the conversation. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.